I thought living in a quiet neighborhood was safe, until Karen knocked on my door. At first, I didn't pay much attention to her. I had just moved into what I thought would be my dream home, a modest but cozy house tucked away in a suburban community that promised peace, order, and the kind of neighborly camaraderie that postcards boast about. I was excited. The lawn was green, the sidewalks were pristine, and everything seemed picture perfect. I imagined Saturday morning coffee on the porch, waving to neighbors as they walked their dogs, and living a life free of chaos. But that illusion was about to shatter faster than I could ever have imagined. It started innocently enough. Karen was the type of neighbor you notice instantly, the kind who exudes authority without anyone asking for it. She had that sharply polished look, manicured nails, a crisp cardigan, and a glare that could curdle milk. She was also the president of our HOA, which I hadn't really thought much about when I signed the papers for my new home. HOA rules were just a vague list of DOS and DON-TS in a booklet I barely skimmed. Right. Wrong. Karen was about to make those rules feel like an iron fist. The first encounter happened on a Tuesday morning. I was sipping my coffee and reading the newspaper when I heard a knock at the door. I opened it to find Karen standing there, a clipboard in hand and a smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. "Good morning," she said, her tone eerily sweet. "I just wanted to discuss a few issues with your property." I didn't understand at first. My lawn was neatly mowed. My driveway was clean. And I hadn't done anything unusual, or so I thought. "Sure," I said, stepping aside to let her in, thinking a polite conversation would clear things up. I had no idea I was about to enter a nightmare I didn't even know existed. Karen immediately launched into what she called community concerns. According to her, my mailbox wasn't aligned perfectly with the HOA-approved angle, and my garden gnome, a whimsical little frog in a top hat, was a blatant violation of community decorum. I tried to laugh it off, assuming she was joking. "Really?" I said, trying to keep my tone light. "A garden gnome." But Karen didn't laugh. She handed me a thick stack of papers, each one meticulously documenting the violations. She told me these issues had to be corrected immediately, or she would escalate the matter to the HOA board. I nodded politely, hiding my frustration. I had moved to this neighborhood for peace, not to be micromanaged by someone obsessed with perfection. I figured I could make the minor adjustments and move on. Little did I know that this was just the beginning of what would become a relentless campaign against me. Over the next few weeks, Karen's visits became more frequent. Each time, she seemed to find something new to critique. One day it was the angle of my porch swing. Another day, she complained that my trash cans were not placed exactly 3 inches from the curb. Every minor detail became a source of contention. I started keeping a record of her visits, notepad in hand, because it was starting to feel like harassment. What made things worse was that Karen had allies. The HOA was a small but influential organization, and Karen seemed to know everyone on the board personally. She would casually drop names and imply that they were watching, waiting for me to slip up. It was a tactic designed to instill fear. And it worked. I began waking up anxious, wondering what new complaint awaited me that day. I started avoiding my own front porch and limiting my interactions with neighbors, feeling increasingly isolated in the community I had once looked forward to enjoying. The tension reached a peak one afternoon when I received a formal notice from the HOA. The letter was aggressive, stating that I was in violation of multiple community guidelines and that I could face fines or even eviction if I didn't comply. My heart sank. Eviction? Over a mailbox and a garden gnome. It felt surreal. I reread the letter several times, hoping I had misunderstood. But the words were clear. Karen, with the full authority of the HOA behind her, had made my life a living nightmare. I decided to confront her directly. I wanted to understand why she was targeting me so aggressively. I arranged a meeting at the community center, hoping that a calm discussion could resolve the issues. Karen arrived, as usual, impeccably dressed and radiating an air of superiority. She didn't even greet me. Instead, she launched immediately into a presentation of all the ways I had allegedly violated HOA rules. Her tone was patronizing, and every sentence was laced with a subtle threat. It was clear that this wasn't tea about rules, it was personal. During that meeting, I realized something crucial. Karen wasn't just enforcing rules. She was asserting power. She thrived on control and had found in me a target. Every attempt to reason with her only seemed to fuel her determination to make my life difficult. I left the community center that day with a sinking feeling. This wasn't going to be a simple fix. This was the beginning of a battle I hadn't asked for, but one I would have to fight. Back at home, I sat in silence, processing the events. I couldn't believe how quickly my dream neighborhood had turned into a source of stress and fear. The peaceful life I had envisioned seemed like a distant memory. I knew one thing. I couldn't let Karen win. I couldn't let her bully me out of my home. And I certainly couldn't allow her to dictate how I lived my life. From that day forward, I started preparing. I researched HOA laws, documented every encounter, and even spoke to neighbors who had had their own run-ins with Karen. Slowly, a picture emerged. Karen's obsession with control wasn't unique to me. She had a history of targeting homeowners who didn't conform to her rigid vision of the neighborhood. Understanding this gave me clarity and, more importantly, the foundation for my eventual plan. Little did Karen know, the more she tried to intimidate me, the more determined I became. Her first knock on my door had been the spark, the moment that transformed my dream into a nightmare. But that same knock also set in motion a journey of empowerment and strategy. I realized that to survive in this neighborhood, I would need more than patience. I would need cunning, creativity, and a willingness to fight back. By the end of the first month, it was clear the nightmare had only just begun. Karen was relentless, and the HOA's power was real. But so was my resolve. I had entered a war I hadn't expected, with a foe I hadn't chosen. And while the battle lines were drawn, I had no intention of surrendering. That first run-in had ignited a fire within me, and the story of my fight against Karen and her HOA tyranny was only beginning. The morning I opened that formal HOA notice, my stomach sank. It wasn't just a piece of paper, it felt like a declaration of war. Karen had taken her obsession with control to a terrifying new level, and I was now fully aware of just how serious she could be. The letter was detailed, listing infractions I hadn't even imagined could be violations. The tilt of my mailbox, the type of mulch in my flower beds, the angle of my garden gnome's hat. Every single point was backed by HOA guidelines that seemed impossibly rigid. And then came the kicker. Failure to comply could result in fines, legal action, and, yes, even eviction. At first, I thought it must be a mistake. Eviction over landscaping and minor decor. Surely there was some common sense somewhere in this organization. But the more I dug, the more I realized that Karen had weaponized the rules to her advantage. Every regulation was a tool she could use to intimidate homeowners. And I had become her latest target. It felt personal. And that's when the fear set in. For the first time, I started to feel trapped in my own home. Every glance at my mailbox or garden seemed to invite scrutiny. I double-checked everything, hoping that if I meticulously aligned my property with the rules, I could appease her. But deep down, I knew it wasn't just about the rules. Karen thrived on power, and I was now in her crosshairs. The threats didn't stop at paperwork. Karen began a series of increasingly aggressive tactics. She sent emails filled with legal jargon, each one designed to confuse and unsettle me. The messages were passive-aggressive, laden with subtle threats. Please be advised that continued noncompliance may result in further action by the HOA. Or, we strongly encourage you to correct these violations promptly to avoid consequences. On the surface, they seemed formal, almost polite, but the underlying message was clear. Obey, or suffer the consequences. It wasn't just the HOA letters. Karen started showing up unannounced, inspecting my property as if she were a self-appointed sheriff. One morning, I was leaving for work when I saw her crouched by my garden, measuring the distance between my flower beds and the sidewalk with a tape measure. She looked up, smiled sweetly, and said, "Just making sure everything is up to code." Her tone made it feel like a threat disguised as friendliness. I wanted to shout, to tell her to leave me alone. But I knew that any confrontation could escalate the situation. Neighbors began to notice the tension too. Some of them whispered about Karen behind her back, sharing their own stories of HOA harassment. It seemed I wasn't the first to experience her brand of intimidation. She had a pattern: find a minor issue, blow it out of proportion, and then leverage HOA rules to assert control. It was methodical, relentless, and exhausting. I started documenting everything. I took photos of my property, saved emails, and kept a log of every visit and every phone call. I knew that if things escalated, I would need evidence to defend myself. Every time I received a new notice, my anxiety spiked. I couldn't predict what Karen would find next or how she would interpret it. The rules, which should have been neutral guidelines, had become weapons in her arsenal, and I was forced to play defense constantly. The real turning point came when I received a second notice. This one more aggressive than the first. Karen accused me of multiple violations, some of which were completely fabricated. She claimed that the direction my porch swing faced violated HOA aesthetics, and that my driveway stones were inconsistent with community standards. I read the letter multiple times, incredulous. Some of the accusations were laughable, but that didn't make them any less threatening. The fines, she warned, would accumulate daily until I corrected these issues or until I faced eviction proceedings. I realized then that this wasn't just about perfectionism, it was about control. Karen was using her position to make homeowners like me anxious, fearful, and compliant. Every letter, every inspection, every casual comment about community standards was a calculated move to exert power. And the worst part, the HOA board seemed complicit, whether they were intimidated by her or genuinely agreed with her obsessive standards. I couldn't tell. All I knew was that I was alone in this fight, and the odds felt stacked against me. Late one night, as I sat at my kitchen table going through yet another round of HOA emails, I felt a wave of anger. Fear had been my first reaction, but now it was turning into resolve. Karen was relentless, but I refused to let her win. I realized that if I wanted to survive in this neighborhood, I needed more than compliance, I needed strategy. I needed to understand the rules better than she did, anticipate her next move, and turn her own obsession against her. I began researching HOA law and community regulations, reading forum posts and legal advice columns from people who had faced similar battles. I discovered that while Karen wielded the rules like a weapon, there were limitations to her power. The HOA could issue fines and warnings, yes, but eviction required legal proof and due process, and every overreach could be challenged in court. This knowledge gave me a glimmer of hope. I wasn't defenseless. I just had to play smart. Armed with information, I started preparing. I meticulously aligned my property with every rule I could verify, documented everything, and even reached out to neighbors who had previously dealt with Karen. They shared stories of minor infractions that had been exaggerated and advised me on ways to protect myself. Slowly, I realized that I wasn't alone. Others had survived Karen's wrath, and so could I. Despite these preparations, the psychological pressure was immense. Every knock on the door, every email, every casual reminder about community standards sent shivers down my spine. I became hyper-aware of my property, double-checking minor details, second-guessing decisions, and constantly bracing for Karen's next move. The stress was relentless, and there were nights I couldn't sleep, imagining eviction notices and courtroom battles. It was during one of these sleepless nights that I realized something important. Karen's power was built on fear. She thrived on homeowners feeling intimidated, on them worrying about fines and eviction. If I could remain calm, informed, and strategic, I could neutralize her power. Her threats were formidable, but not invincible. Understanding that was the first step toward turning the tables. As weeks passed, Karen continued her campaign, but I was no longer reacting blindly. I responded to emails with carefully worded messages, always polite but firm, asking for clarification and documentation. I documented every interaction, building a case that could protect me if things escalated further. The more she tried to intimidate me, the more evidence I gathered of her obsession and overreach. By the end of that first month under siege, I understood the full scope of Karen's strategy. The HOA rules, once a simple guideline, had become weapons in her hands. Every inspection, every letter, every fine was designed to assert dominance and create fear. But I also realized that knowledge, preparation, and documentation could neutralize those threats. Karen may have tried to use the rules to control me, but I was beginning to see a path forward, a way to fight back and reclaim my peace of mind. The nightmare of HOA threats had revealed Karen's true nature. She was cunning, relentless, and manipulative, but she was not unbeatable. I had learned to anticipate her moves, protect myself legally, and stay calm under pressure. And while the battle was far from over, I knew one thing with certainty. I wasn't going to let her or her rules dictate my life. The fight had begun, and this time, I was ready to play offense as well as defense. You don't mess with me and get away with it. I had a plan. After weeks of enduring Karen's relentless harassment, the constant HOA threats, and the sleepless nights filled with anxiety, I realized that passive compliance wasn't going to save me. Karen thought she could intimidate me into submission, bend me to her obsessive rules, and scare me into obedience, but she was about to learn that I wasn't the kind of person to back down quietly. The time for caution had passed. It was time to take control, to turn the tables, and to execute a countermove that would make her regret ever targeting me. At first, I didn't know where to start. Karen had mastered the art of micromanagement. She knew the HOA rules inside out, and she wielded them like a weapon against unsuspecting homeowners. Every minor deviation from the community guidelines became an opportunity for her to assert dominance. I needed a strategy that was both clever and legal, something that would protect me while exposing her overreach. I spent nights researching HOA law, reading forum posts from homeowners who had faced similar tyrants, and learning how to document interactions in a way that could hold up in court if necessary. Knowledge, I realized, was my first weapon. I also started paying attention to Karen's patterns. She had habits, predictable routines, and weaknesses that could be exploited. She always inspected homes on weekdays between 9 a.m. and 11 a.m., carried a clipboard, and seemed to love dramatizing her authority in front of neighbors. She had a tendency to overreact to minor infractions but would sometimes overlook details if distracted. It wasn't much, but it was enough. Every observation became a piece of the puzzle for my plan. My countermove had 3 components: strategy, documentation, and psychological impact. First, I would protect myself by ensuring that my property was completely in compliance with HOA rules. Every mailbox, every garden gnome, every blade of grass would meet the letter of the law. Karen could no longer accuse me without proof, and any future attempts would be exposed for what they truly were: harassment. I spent hours meticulously checking every inch of my property, aligning decorations, measuring distances, and photographing everything. The goal wasn't perfection, it was immunity. Second, I began gathering evidence of Karen's overreach. I recorded conversations, legally, of course, saved every email, took timestamps of her visits, and even discreetly spoke to neighbors who had experienced similar harassment. Their stories mirrored mine. Karen loved using the HOA as a tool to intimidate and control. With documentation, I could show the board, or even legal authorities if necessary, that Karen's actions were excessive and unwarranted. Evidence, I realized, was the ultimate equalizer. But the final piece of the plan, the psychological impact, was where it got interesting. Karen thrived on fear, and fear was her primary weapon. The moment I stopped being afraid, I knew I could unsettle her. I started small, polite, firm responses to emails that subtly indicated I was well informed, confident, and documenting everything. I maintained an air of calm whenever she came around, refusing to let her intimidation tactics provoke me. The goal was to make her doubt herself, to show that I was not a victim, and to slowly chip away at her sense of control. I also began thinking creatively. How could I outmaneuver her in ways she wouldn't see coming? I realized that public perception mattered. Karen loved performing her authority in front of neighbors, making people think she was the benevolent enforcer of community rules. If I could turn that around, if I could subtly expose her obsession with control, I could undermine her credibility without violating any laws myself. It was like a chess game. I needed patience, foresight, and precision. One day, I noticed a minor HOA guideline that Karen had been exploiting repeatedly. It stated that homeowners must maintain aesthetic consistency with the neighborhood. The rule was vague, open to interpretation, and perfect for her dramatic inspections. But I also saw an opportunity. I started making small, legal adjustments to my property that were technically within the rules but visually striking in ways that were difficult for Karen to criticize. Every adjustment was subtle but noticeable enough to make her obsessive inspections seem absurd to anyone observing. It was a way to use the rules against her without breaking a single law. I also leveraged the neighbors' perspective. I began casually engaging with them, subtly discussing HOA rules and my ongoing compliance efforts, planting seeds of awareness about Karen's behavior. People started noticing her over-the-top scrutiny, and whispers of discontent began circulating. The psychological shift was important. If Karen could no longer intimidate the community, her power diminished. Social dynamics, I realized, were as important as legal tactics. While planning, I also prepared for the worst-case scenario. I consulted a lawyer specializing in HOA disputes, learning exactly what Karen could and couldn't do, and what protections I had as a homeowner. Knowledge gave me confidence, and confidence was essential. I wasn't just preparing to survive her attacks, I was preparing to neutralize them and, eventually, to strike back in a way that was fair, clever, and satisfying. By this point, I had a clear strategy: comply to protect, document to empower, and subtly undermine to disarm. Karen thought she had all the power, but she underestimated one crucial thing. I wasn't afraid anymore. The transformation was psychological as much as strategic. I no longer saw myself as a victim. I saw myself as a player in a complex game, and I was ready to move decisively. The first test of my plan came sooner than I expected. Karen showed up unannounced one morning, clipboard in hand, eyes scanning my property for violations. She stopped at my mailbox, frowned, and muttered something about alignment. But when she looked up at me, she saw something different. I was calm, confident, and fully prepared. I handed her a neatly organized binder, containing photographs, measurements, and references to HOA rules showing my compliance. Her eyes widened. She opened her mouth, but I cut her off politely. I've made sure everything meets the HOA guidelines, I said firmly, and I've documented it thoroughly. If you notice anything that genuinely violates the rules, please let me know in writing so it can be addressed properly. Karen froze. This was new. No one had ever confronted her like this before. Calm, informed, and unshakable, she scanned the binder, muttered something about needing to review it, and left. I felt a surge of satisfaction. The first move in my counterattack had worked. She had no argument, no leverage, and for the first time, her confidence faltered. From that day forward, I became even more deliberate. I anticipated her inspections, stayed 2 steps ahead, and kept careful records of every interaction. My plan wasn't about aggression, it was about turning her own tactics back on her, using intelligence and strategy rather than fear and reaction. I was building momentum, preparing for the moment when Karen would finally realize that I wasn't just defending myself, I was taking control. And then came the day when the countermove truly began to take shape. I had collected enough evidence, observed enough patterns, and crafted enough subtle provocations that I could start pushing back in ways Karen hadn't anticipated. Every move was calculated to expose her obsession with control. Every response designed to show the HOA and neighbors that her tactics were excessive. And every small victory built confidence for the larger showdown that was inevitably coming. In those quiet moments, I realized something important. Revenge wasn't about rage or anger, it was about strategy, patience, and precision. It was about reclaiming control over my life, exposing abuse of authority, and turning fear into empowerment. Karen had underestimated me at every turn, and now it was my turn to dictate the pace. The perfect revenge was no longer a fantasy. It was a plan in motion, meticulously crafted and ready to unfold. I had gone from being intimidated and stressed to calm, focused, and strategic. Every inspection, every email, every subtle move on my property was a part of the counterattack. Karen had turned the rules into weapons against me. But now I was using those same rules and her own obsession to fight back. The game had changed. And for the first time, I felt a sense of exhilaration amidst the tension. The nightmare might have started with Karen, but my revenge story was only beginning. And it was going to be epic. It all came to a head on a sunny afternoon. And Karen did not see it coming. The neighborhood was quiet. Birds chirped lazily in the trees. And the air smelled of freshly cut grass, a perfect suburban postcard. But beneath the calm exterior, tension crackled like static electricity. I had spent weeks planning, strategizing, and documenting every move, every email, and every inspection Karen had ever conducted. I was ready. The showdown wasn't just about compliance anymore. It was about reclaiming my peace, exposing her obsession, and finally ending the nightmare she had created. That morning, I noticed Karen's car pulling into the street before she even knocked. Predictable as ever, she came with her clipboard, her glasses perched just so, eyes scanning every detail of my property with that signature look of judgment. I greeted her politely but confidently, holding the binder I had prepared meticulously, every document in chronological order, every violation countered with proof of compliance. Karen smirked, thinking she had the upper hand. She stepped onto my driveway, clipboard ready, probably expecting me to wilt under her glare. But this time, I wasn't intimidated. I had rehearsed my words, anticipated her accusations, and most importantly, remained calm. I opened the binder and started laying out my evidence. Photos, measurements, HOA guidelines, timestamps of previous inspections, even notes from neighbors who had observed her obsessive behavior. Her eyes flicked nervously over the pages. I could see the shift in her demeanor. The smug, self-assured Karen was cracking. She stammered slightly, trying to find a point of attack. But there wasn't one. Every accusation she had leveled at me had been meticulously addressed. Every threat documented and countered. The power she once wielded effortlessly was slipping through her fingers. And I felt a surge of satisfaction. You've documented all of this?" she asked, her voice tight, almost incredulous. "Yes," I replied evenly. "I've ensured everything complies with HOA rules. If there's a concern, I am happy to address it formally in writing. Otherwise, I'd appreciate that the personal attacks stop." Her mouth opened, then closed. She glanced at the clipboard in her hand, as if suddenly unsure of how to proceed. This was the moment I had been preparing for, the moment when her control faltered, and the truth of her obsession became visible. She had underestimated me at every turn, and now she was confronted with a homeowner who was calm, informed, and unshakable. Karen's next move was predictable but desperate. She started pointing to minor details: my mailbox, the alignment of my garden stones, the position of my gnome, as if anything could still give her leverage. But each time, I countered with evidence, showing measurements, HOA guidelines, and photographs proving compliance. She tried to argue, but every point was dismantled systematically. It was clear she hadn't anticipated someone fighting back this thoroughly, and the frustration was visible. At that moment, a small crowd of neighbors began to gather, curious about the unusually tense scene on my driveway. Karen was used to solo inspections, wielding her authority without witnesses. Now, with neighbors observing, her theatrics lost some of their intimidation power. I casually engaged them, mentioning the documentation and the precise compliance measures I had taken. The murmurs of recognition and understanding from the neighbors was subtle, but powerful social validation was now shifting in my favor. Karen's composure began to crumble. She snapped at one neighbor who had made a casual comment about HOA regulations, her voice rising in frustration. This was the exact overreaction I had anticipated. Her obsession with control, her need to dominate, was now her undoing. The more she tried to assert authority, the more obvious her behavior became to everyone watching. She was no longer just a neighborhood enforcer. She was a tyrant exposed. I decided it was time for the final move in my carefully crafted strategy. I asked Karen to step aside while I walked through the property, pointing out specific compliance measures with calm precision. Each step, each gesture, reinforced my preparation and confidence. I spoke clearly about the rules, the documentation, and the evidence of compliance. I let her attempts at intimidation fade into background noise, knowing that the social and legal pressure I had built would speak louder than her angry words. Karen tried one last desperate tactic. She threatened fines and implied further legal action. But I was ready. I calmly cited the HOA bylaws regarding documentation, notification, and due process, pointing out where she had overstepped her authority. Her face paled. The power dynamics had shifted completely. I was no longer the target, I was the strategist, the one in control of the narrative. Karen's threats sounded hollow, her authority questioned not just by me but by everyone observing the scene. The neighbors, sensing the drama unfolding, started to murmur among themselves. Whispers about Karen's obsessive behavior and overreach grew louder. Some nodded in agreement. Others exchanged knowing glances. The social validation was overwhelming. Karen's carefully cultivated image of authority was unraveling. I realized that her power wasn't just rooted in rules. It relied heavily on perception. Once that perception was challenged, her control evaporated. By the time Karen finally left, her posture slumped and her expression tight. I felt a sense of triumph I hadn't expected. The showdown was over, and the battlefield was my own driveway. But the victory wasn't just personal, it was public. The neighbors had witnessed my composure, my evidence, and my ability to challenge the overreach of someone who had terrorized the community for too long. Karen had underestimated the power of preparation, documentation, and confidence, and it had cost her. In the days following the showdown, the neighborhood dynamic shifted noticeably. Karen continued her inspections, but she was cautious, hesitant, and visibly aware that her authority was no longer absolute. Homeowners who had previously kept quiet began to speak up, subtly questioning her tactics. The social fabric of the community began to tilt away from her obsessive control. I had not only defended myself but had created an environment where her tyranny could no longer thrive unchecked. The epic showdown had also changed me. I realized the value of preparation, strategy, and calm assertiveness. I had learned to convert fear into power, frustration into action, and intimidation into an opportunity to assert control. Karen had tried to bully me into compliance, but through careful planning and confidence, I had turned the tables. It wasn't revenge in the sense of malice. It was a reclamation of autonomy, a demonstration that intelligence, patience, and composure could overcome unchecked authority. As I looked around the neighborhood in the weeks that followed, I noticed small but meaningful changes. Neighbors greeted me with respect, acknowledging the courage it took to stand up to Karen. Some even shared stories of their own run-ins, expressing relief that someone had finally challenged her. The HOA, once a tool of fear, began to operate with more transparency, likely influenced by the public exposure of Karen's overreach. In the end, the epic showdown was about more than just one homeowner and one obsessive neighbor. It was about empowerment. It demonstrated that rules, while important, should not be manipulated to control or intimidate. It showed that careful preparation, documentation, and confidence could neutralize even the most persistent threats. And most importantly, it proved that no amount of bullying or obsessive control could withstand a well-executed strategic response. Karen may have believed she held all the power that sunny afternoon, clipboard in hand, but the truth was undeniable. The neighborhood had seen her for what she was, and I had reclaimed my peace, dignity, and control. The showdown was epic not because of anger or confrontation, but because it was a triumph of strategy, intelligence, and courage over intimidation and tyranny. That sunny afternoon marked the turning point. Karen had lost her grip, and I had proven that no matter how relentless a bully might be, preparation, calm assertiveness, and strategic thinking could outmatch even the most obsessive authority. It was a lesson not just for Karen, not just for me, but for the entire neighborhood, a reminder that true power comes not from fear, but from knowledge, confidence, and the courage to stand your ground. In the end, the neighborhood learned a lesson, and I walked out victorious. The showdown with Karen had changed everything. Her relentless harassment, her obsession with control, and her misuse of HOA rules had all led to this moment. A moment I had meticulously prepared for and finally brought to fruition. After weeks of tension, planning, and careful maneuvering, justice wasn't just an abstract concept, it was real, tangible, and satisfying. The days following the epic confrontation were a mixture of anticipation and subtle triumph. Karen, once so confident, now moved through the neighborhood like a storm cloud with holes in it. Her authority diminished. Her aura of intimidation shattered. She continued her inspections, but they were cautious, hesitant, almost apologetic in tone. I could see the frustration etched on her face, a silent acknowledgement that the game had changed. The balance of power had shifted, and it was no longer hers to wield. I took the opportunity to continue documenting everything, not out of fear, but to ensure that if Karen tried to retaliate, the evidence would speak louder than her words. Every interaction, every minor complaint, every attempt to assert dominance was now meticulously recorded. I had transformed my vigilance from a source of stress into a tool of empowerment. Knowledge was my ally, and it gave me confidence that nothing Karen could do would surprise me again. But my victory wasn't just personal, it had ripple effects across the community. Neighbors who had previously felt powerless began to speak up. Quiet conversations turned into open discussions about HOA rules and Karen's overreach. People realized that they didn't have to accept intimidation as a normal part of neighborhood life. Karen's reputation, once carefully curated, was now public knowledge. A woman obsessed with control, using the rules not for fairness, but for personal dominance. The shift in community perception was palpable, and I could feel the subtle gratitude and respect from those around me. The HOA board, which had often been a silent accomplice to Karen's tactics, also began to take notice. Complaints reached them not just from me, but from several neighbors who had quietly endured similar harassment. The board could no longer ignore the pattern, and internal discussions started to reflect a desire for transparency, accountability, and fairness. Karen's once unquestioned authority was being scrutinized, and her ability to wield power unchecked was effectively neutralized. It wasn't an overnight transformation, but over time, the neighborhood began to breathe easier. Meetings that had once been tense, where Karen had dominated conversations with her obsessive attention to minutiae, became forums for collaboration and open dialogue. Homeowners shared ideas, expressed concerns, and engaged in constructive discussions about community standards. It was a complete reversal from the climate of fear that had existed before, and I knew that my stand had played a pivotal role in this change. The satisfaction of this victory wasn't merely symbolic. Legally, I was secure. Every threat, every complaint, every attempt at fines or eviction had been carefully countered with evidence. Karen's obsession with using the HOA as a weapon had become her undoing. By documenting everything and ensuring my property was fully compliant, I had removed any leverage she might have had. Her threats became empty, her intimidation tactics powerless, and the HOA could no longer use her as a tool of fear against me or anyone else. There were moments of quiet triumph too. I would occasionally walk past my house and notice the little signs of her frustration and inspection that lasted a few minutes instead of hours. Her clipboard held awkwardly in hand. Her usual assertive posture softened. It was subtle, almost poetic, to see the woman who had once dominated and intimidated reduced to cautious hesitation. Justice, I realized, didn't always have to be loud or dramatic. Sometimes, It was the quiet confidence and preparedness of a person who refused to be bullied that delivered the most effective retribution. Beyond the neighborhood and the HOA, the experience taught me invaluable lessons about resilience, strategy, and empowerment. I learned that fear can be transformed into power, that careful planning and preparation can neutralize even the most relentless adversaries, and that standing your ground is not just about defending your home, it's about reclaiming your life. Karen had underestimated me at every turn, and her mistakes had been as much about arrogance as they were about control. I had played the long game, and in the end, it had paid off. One afternoon, several weeks after the showdown, a small gathering of neighbors took place in my front yard. People came together to discuss upcoming community projects and shared their appreciation for the way things had changed. Conversations flowed freely. Laughter returned, and there was a sense of unity that had been absent for far too long. In that moment, I realized the full extent of my victory. It wasn't just that I had outsmarted Karen. It was that the community had reclaimed its voice, its confidence, and its sense of fairness. Karen's eventual retreat from the center of neighborhood authority was both inevitable and satisfying. While she continued to live in the community, her influence waned. The board implemented clearer policies, ensuring that rules could not be twisted to target individuals unfairly. Neighbors no longer felt the constant pressure of being monitored or judged, and a culture of respect and collaboration began to take root. Karen's obsession with control had been exposed, her tactics neutralized, and justice had been served not through anger, but through strategic action, persistence, and composure. Reflecting on the entire ordeal, I understood that my path to victory had been as much psychological as it was practical. By remaining calm, documenting every interaction, preparing meticulously, and strategically undermining Karen's overreach, I had turned fear into a tool of empowerment. Every step of my countermove had been calculated to maintain integrity while demonstrating strength. The result was a comprehensive, undeniable triumph that left no room for ambiguity. Karen had lost her grip, and I had regained control of my life. Victory was sweeter because it wasn't just about me. It was about justice for anyone who had ever felt powerless under an obsessive authority. It was about reclaiming a neighborhood, a community, and a sense of peace that had been threatened. The story of Karen's obsession, her misuse of HOA rules, and the eventual triumph of careful strategy and determination became a quiet legend among neighbors, a reminder that intelligence, patience, and courage could prevail over tyranny. In the weeks and months that followed, life returned to normal, but with a new sense of security and empowerment. I walked through the neighborhood without anxiety, greeted neighbors with ease, and even enjoyed my porch for the first time without feeling scrutinized. The small details of daily life, once a source of stress, became symbols of victory. My garden gnome, mailbox, and porch swing, every element of my property stood as proof that careful preparation and resilience could withstand even the most obsessive scrutiny. Karen's presence remained, but her influence had been diminished. She could no longer impose fear or manipulate the rules for personal gain. The community had learned a lesson. Authority without accountability is fragile, and intimidation can be neutralized by knowledge, preparation, and courage. I had not only survived the ordeal, but I had emerged stronger, wiser, and respected not only by my neighbors, but by myself. Ultimately, the story concluded with a sense of justice and closure. Karen had been exposed, the HOA's procedures had been clarified, and the neighborhood had regained its voice. I had walked out victorious, not through confrontation or malice, but through strategy, meticulous planning, and unwavering composure. It was a triumph of intellect over intimidation, of preparation over fear, and of justice over obsession. The lessons I learned extended far beyond that sunny suburban street. I realized that anyone facing unreasonable authority, whether in a neighborhood, workplace, or community, can reclaim power through careful planning, documentation, and strategic action. Karen's obsession, once a source of anxiety, became the catalyst for empowerment. And in the end, the victory wasn't just mine, it was a victory for fairness, justice, and the principle that no one should be bullied into submission. Walking through my neighborhood that afternoon, I smiled. Birds still chirped. Grass still smelled fresh. And sunlight danced on the sidewalks. Everything looked ordinary. But it wasn't. Behind the calm exterior lay a story of perseverance, strategy, and triumph. The nightmare Karen had created was over. Justice had been served. And I had emerged victorious. A homeowner, a strategist, and a symbol of resilience for anyone who had ever felt powerless under the weight of an obsessive authority. If you enjoyed this story, hit that subscribe button and join the family.